Hi everyone, Sarah here, your DIY home gal, and today I'm going to walk you through the whole process on how to install glue down luxury vinyl tile from start to finish. I started by using a little muscle to tear out all the cracked tile in my entryway, and there was a layer of linoleum flooring underneath this as well that started coming up as I was pulling out the tile. I did have both the tile and the linoleum tested for asbestos before taking anything out, so just make sure you do the same so that you know yours is safe to remove as well. Many LVT products can actually be installed right over top of existing linoleum and tile, so it might not even be necessary to remove if yours is already well secured to your subfloor, flat, and structurally sound. I also took out all the laminate in the kitchen, which luckily came up really easy, and I'm going to reinstall this in our guest bedroom downstairs so that it doesn't go to waste. Okay, so now that we're down to subfloor, you're going to want to fix any squeaks by adding extra screws. Take a closer look at your subfloor, and if it was previously only nailed down, add a screw next to every nail along the floor joists. The squeaking is caused by the subfloor and nail rubbing against one another when the subfloor moves as you walk across it, so screwing it down will get rid of that problem and make sure it doesn't come back. You're also going to want to fill any holes in your subfloor, so for this I just cut down a scrap piece of wood small enough to fit in the hole and then put a screw in it so I had something to hold onto while I screwed it into the subfloor. I forgot to film it, but you can see here that I also added a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, which is the same thickness of my subfloor, and then finally I patched that all up with floor leveling compound. Now the problem I faced after removing all that linoleum was that it left behind a hardened glue residue all over the subfloor. I tried scraping it off, I also tried sanding it off, and it was just gumming up the sandpaper in like 2 seconds, so I decided to lay down 1/4 inch plywood as an underlay and then basically just cover up the glue. Give your subfloor a really good vacuum before you start laying down underlay. You don't want any dirt or debris trapped under there. And I like to get right down pretty much to eye level so that I can do one last check if there's any nails sticking up that need to be hammered down. I have since heard that an angle grinder will typically do the trick to remove glue residue, so that might be worth a try if you're in the same boat before jumping to laying down new plywood. But whichever road you decide to take, just keep in mind that your subfloor has to be free of any old adhesive before installing glue down LVT, or else the new adhesive might not work properly. I'm using 1/4 inch birch plywood for my underlay since that was the only option at my local hardware store, and it worked just fine, but they do also make plywood specifically meant for underlay, so take a look at the options in your area. The main thing is that you'll want to make sure you choose something that's really smooth and free from imperfections. Okay, now to secure each sheet, I'm using a crown stapler with 1/4 by 1 1/8 inch staples. You can rent this from pretty much any tool rental place, so no need to run out and buy a new tool if you don't already have one. You might also be wondering whether you can just use a nailer for this project, and from what I've seen, it's not recommended since nails just don't have enough holding power for material that's this thin. Here you can see I'm just stapling from one side of the sheet all the way across to the other to smooth out any warp in the plywood, and you'll want to staple in rows about 6 inches apart and around 2 inches between each staple. And don't forget to undercut your door jamb so that both your underlay and your LVTs will slide right underneath for a seamless finish. To do this, I used a multi-tool and measured the thickness of both materials, marked that out with a pencil on the jamb, and then just eyeballed the rest, but you can also use scrap material as a guide for your cut. I also want to mention that to cut down your plywood underlay, you have a couple options. For small cuts like this, I just grab my jigsaw, but then for any bigger cuts, you can use a circular saw or a table saw. You'll just want to make sure that you adjust your blade height so that your blade is sitting only slightly higher than the material. Now you might notice as you're shooting your staples in that you have a couple here and there that are still sticking up a little bit. No biggie, just grab your hammer, give it a couple good whacks, and you're good to go. Once you've got all your plywood underlay down, you are going to want to go back in with a floor leveling compound and then fill all of those seams where 2 pieces of plywood meet. You'll also want to fill any large depressions. So to find these, I just went around with a big level, but you can also use anything else with a straight edge. You can see I had this really large one right in the middle of my kitchen, so I basically just threw down a bunch of leveling compound, and then I used a scrap piece of trim as well as an 18-inch taping knife to spread it and smooth it out. I will say it took like 72 hours for this giant patch to dry fully though, so you'd probably be better off doing several thinner coats if you're filling a deep depression like this. Once it is fully dry though, just give it a good sand, make sure you feather out those edges, and then get rid of any high spots as well. Please don't be dumb like me though and forget to hook a shop vac up to your sander, because as you can see, it gets real dusty. Luckily, I realized my mistake pretty quick and hooked one up to sand the other spot that I filled. Okay, that was a lot of work, but the good news is we're ready to start installing our new floors. So to start, you're just going to want to go ahead and measure out your space so that you plan your layout around any specs in your install instructions. The product I'm installing specified that end pieces shouldn't be any shorter than half a tile wide, so I had to take that into consideration. Then snap a chalk line down the center of your room, and this is going to be your guideline for when you're laying out your tiles. Especially for that first tile you put down, really take your time and get it squared right up to that chalk line, because the layout for all the rest of the tiles are based off that first one. So if your first one's off, then everything's going to be off. We're going to be working in small sections, moving from one side of the room all the way across to the other. So we'll start by laying out all the tiles for one section and then making sure they all fit before we glue them down. If you flip over your tiles, they'll likely have a directional arrow on the back. So as you're putting them down, just make sure that all of the arrows are facing the same way. And then also keep in mind that you need to leave a 2 to 5 millimeter gap between the edge of the LVT and any walls to account for expansion. The great thing about these tiles is that cutting them down is super easy. As you can see here, I needed to cut out a corner of this tile to fit around my kitchen cabinet, and a jigsaw made easy work of that. You can also use a sharp X-Acto knife and a straight edge to score a line, and then the tile will just snap right off. I found with these ones that you needed to score a line, snap it, and then score it again from the back side, similar to how you'd cut down a sheet of drywall. All right, so once you have all the tiles for that section cut down and fitting together well, we're going to remove them all again so that we can prep to glue them down. And I just kept each row in its own pile so that I could remember what goes where when I go to reinstall them. Now we'll give that section a really thorough vacuum because you don't want any dirt or debris crunching under your new floors. And finally, we're all set for glue. So here I'm using a pressure sensitive adhesive and then spreading that out with a 3/32-inch flat V-notch trowel. Be sure to get your glue right up into all the corners and the edges, and you will want to wait until the glue is tacky before you start laying down your tile. I found waiting about 10 minutes was the sweet spot, but just be sure to read the instructions for whatever brand of adhesive you're using, since they're probably all slightly different. Okay, great. So now that we've got that whole section of tile glued down, we're going to go over it all with a roller, working from all directions to ensure that our adhesive is spread evenly and that the tiles are secured down. I just rented a pressure roller for this, but you can also use a weighted roller. Again, just check the instructions on your adhesive since it should specify what weight to use. And then once that's done, we can move on to the next section and continue just like that, working on one section at a time, dry fitting all the tiles and cutting them down, and then spreading out adhesive, gluing the tiles down, and then finally rolling it all out until the whole space is completed. And there you go, just like that, you have brand new floors. I'm not gonna lie, this was a pretty big project that took me a few weekends to complete, but if you're considering doing this yourself, I'd say it's absolutely doable, even without any prior flooring experience. And especially if your subfloor is already in good condition, you can skip that whole step of laying down plywood underlay. I'll have all the tools and materials I used linked in the description box below, and then please feel free to leave any questions you might have in the comments.